Developer Leanzy follows a well-trodden path with its debut project, the Unreal Engine 5 soulslike Wuchang Fallen Feathers, and for what it is, it nails the core essentials. Credit where it's due, its Chinese mythology-inspired setting is a real highlight. Each temple, dungeon, and creature is rendered beautifully using UE5, creating an eerie, fantastical world blighted by a mysterious disease. This level of detail is further brought to life by the engine's Lumen GI and reflections, a hybrid ray tracing technique that demands current-gen console exclusivity and also PC hardware to run. Also, surprisingly, Wuchang Fallen Feathers manages to squeeze all of its world into a rather diminutive 15GB install package on PS5, and the other headline is that PS5 Pro gets an enhanced version of the game, allowing a tighter lock at 60fps and a few other unexpected tweaks. So, just how do the four consoles here compare in performance and visuals in their pursuit of perfect 60fps play? And does the 4 teraflop Series S actually stand a chance of keeping up, or are there sacrifices on the visual front? Let's find out. To cut to the chase, every console version of Wuchang features 3 modes: a prioritized FPS mode for 60 frames per second, a 40 FPS balanced mode, and a 30 FPS prioritized graphics mode. Be warned though, for the 40 FPS cap to actually engage in the balanced mode, you will need a 120Hz display attached. To explain a bit more there's a separate frame rate lock option which enables each cap, either 30, 40 or 60 FPS depending on mode, but this lock disables automatically in the balanced mode if your console is connected to only a 60Hz monitor. As a result, in that case, the game's frame rate will run unlocked, which produces an unsightly amount of screen tearing at 60Hz. It's really not the recommended way to play. Otherwise, in terms of comparisons, there are only minor differences between all 3 modes in visual settings. Taking base PS5 in example, there's a tweak to ambient occlusion quality, plus marginally less pop-in for foliage on the graphics mode, but it's rarely substantial enough to notice in play. Rather, a larger factor is each mode's resolution target and the knock-on impact on image quality. The resolution figures for Wuchang should come as no surprise if you're familiar with other UE5 titles using Lumen on console, like Lords of the Fallen. Both base PS5 and Series X share the same values, with a dynamic 540p to 864p range in the FPS mode being the lowest you'll see. The balanced mode settles for a better, typically fixed 810p target, and finally, the graphics mode adjusts dynamically between 900p and 1188p for the sharpest image. Sadly, for those chasing a 60fps experience, you'll have to accept an at times low base pixel count, down to 540p in the worst case. That does manifest in the upscale. The artifacting is similar in nature, in fact, to Lords of the Fallen's own 60fps mode, where any sudden lighting change or busy swaying foliage often struggles to resolve to the target resolution. It produces a garbled, pixelated effect, especially for the first few frames as a character obscures and reveals these elements. Speaking on performance, that 60fps mode is still easily the recommended pick on PS5 and Series X, even with those low base pixel counts. In terms of sheer playability, for timing every dodge and parry, there's simply no contest. Most of play does generally rest at the 60fps line too, which is great news, but it's certainly not perfect. There are 2 principal issues on PS5 and Series X that hold this mode back, the first being a byproduct of the dynamic resolution scaling, ranging between 540p and 864p of course. A sudden camera movement, for example, cueing a change in GPU load, might take the renderer off guard before it can change resolution in time. Much like in Assassin's Creed, it's in this transition period, between looking up at the sky and at more complex scenery, that a drop in frame rate is possible down to the 50s. The second issue is the hitching while exploring the world, a point that affects Series X more obviously. This is partly related to the game's autosave system, whereby an orange autosave mascot icon pops up in the top right just as you pass certain points in the world. This often coincides with multi-frame drops on Series X, and always with the same pattern. First, the icon appears, and then a small bout of stuttering begins, and sometimes it simply happens without that icon appearing, suggesting traversal streaming issues. It's not ideal, and while the severity of those hitches is noticeably reduced in the same spots on PS5, it's not 100% problem solved there either. Still, again, the FPS mode's push for 60 frames per second makes the most sense for Wuchang's timing-sensitive combat, but do expect drops and hitches along the way. Next along, the 30 FPS graphics mode is hard to recommend on either PS5 or Series X. Not even to speak on the extra input delay while running with a 30 FPS cap, the game is also unevenly frame-paced at 30 FPS, meaning there's obvious judder to camera pans. One way to disguise this to an extent is by enabling motion blur, which helps to blend one frame to another, but this blur effect in Wuchang is so aggressive that it makes the action rather hard to read. A blur intensity slider would have been appreciated here. In other words, if you're determined to use the 30 FPS graphics mode, you're either left with a heavy, obvious judder, or an ugly smear with that motion blur enabled. Not ideal. The 40 FPS balanced mode, meanwhile, is of course inherently smoother, but demands you output to a 120Hz display if you want a V-synced 40 FPS cap. Assuming you do have the console running at 120Hz though, this capped 40 FPS approach wouldn't be such a bad option, except it too has uneven frame pacing. The line is a stable one at 40 FPS on both PS5 and Series X, but you'll still see judder in motion as a result of the fluctuating frame times there. Overall, the best route for both consoles is to keep it at 60 FPS, where despite the loss in image quality, it's still the mode with the least distracting issues. Let's address the Xbox Series S situation next. Impressively, Series S keeps all three modes of the other more premium machines, the graphics, balanced and FPS modes, and even that FPS lock toggle makes the cut. Having this feature parity involves a sacrifice though, and inevitably, all the native resolution values are tweaked for Series S. The FPS mode runs at between 432p and 648p, the balanced mode is typically fixed at 540p, and rounding out, the graphics mode runs at between 600p and 756p. No question then, compared to Series X on the same mode, image quality takes a nosedive. Especially on fine hair or foliage elements, you'll spot heavy blocking artifacts as Series S attempts to upscale a low base resolution frame, notably at 60 FPS. On top of this, Series S's 60 FPS mode disables the Lumen GI setting, meaning that the game's environment is instead lit and shaded with a duller baked solution. The result is that indirect bounce lighting on grass is removed, and likewise, interiors lose all that simulated light bounce from nearby torches. It creates a stark difference when compared to Series X's own FPS mode, and lumen reflections are also chopped out while using this mode. Thankfully, lumen is restored on Series S's balanced and graphics modes, which puts lighting closer to PS5 and Series X overall. Even so, and regardless of which mode you use of the three, there are other downgrades on Series S. Texture quality is dropped across the environment, leaving behind these often muddy grass and rock materials. Shadow quality is also dropped, grass no longer animates underfoot, and finally, ambient occlusion under grass runs at a noticeably lower preset than other consoles, causing flicker. Despite these cutbacks, Series S's push for 60 FPS is the most laboured out of all the consoles. It's broadly, in fairness, in the VRR window if your display supports it, but we're getting 45 to 60 FPS using this FPS mode, with some of the lower GPU side drops caused by effects in battle, or even putting waterfalls in view. So, even without Lumen GI and reflections to worry about, and running at much lower resolutions, the reality is that Series S will drop frequently under the 60 FPS target, plus it suffers from the same traversal and autosave hitching issue as Series X. This is still the recommended mode though, and the lesser evil, so to speak, when compared to the 30 and 40 FPS modes. On which note, the 30 FPS graphics mode has, of course, all the very same issues with frame pacing on Series S as on Series X, though due to its hardware limitations, it also adds dips under that 30 FPS target. Heavy action, such as one early boss encounter in this temple courtyard, struggles to lock at a tight 30, and it may be a sign of further drops to come on Series S later in the game. Meanwhile, the 40 FPS balanced mode doesn't improve matters. The frame pacing issue at 40 FPS is still present, and in fixing the resolution at a static 540p target in the balanced mode, Series S doesn't have the flexibility here to adjust to GPU load. Hence, drops under 40 FPS and even into the mid-20s are very much possible in more complex areas. Overall, the best mode to use on Series S is neither of these, and the 60 FPS performance option is really the one to go for, ideally if you've a VRR display attached. PlayStation 5 Pro is in the spotlight next, and simply put, it keeps all visual settings from base PS5, including those very same DRS ranges per mode. However, the promised Pro enhancements come in a different form, in that it changes the frame rate target on certain graphics modes. It also makes it more viable to hit the existing frame rate caps. So while outputting at 60Hz for example, the 60 FPS performance mode remains with a 60 FPS target, of course, but the advantage there is that PS5 Pro more commonly occupies the higher end of the DRS range, and the other advantage is that PS5 Pro is far less prone to the sub-60 drops that we see on base PS5 using this mode. The traversal hitching is greatly minimized on Pro hardware, and it's much harder to catch the DRS system off guard and trigger a drop by suddenly changing camera view. This mode is more robust in other words, and it means that PS5 Pro offers the smoothest way to play Wuchang this way. The graphics and balanced modes on PS5 Pro see a bigger change in setup. Again, the core visual settings, the resolution ranges, shadow quality, AO, textures, effects are identical to base PS5. The big difference though is in their frame rate caps. On the graphics mode for example, on a 60Hz display, the frame rate is now instead capped to 60 FPS on PS5 Pro, double that of the 30 FPS cap on base hardware. The downside is that it's far from a stable 60, it's more like a wavering 40 to 60 depending on the scene complexity, effects and so on. Ultimately, VRR displays will have a decent go at turning this into a relatively smooth experience, but drops below 48 FPS still appear as judder on those displays. Accepting that though, for those wanting to keep the higher 900p to 1180p DRS range here, while targeting 60 FPS, this is now a much more worthwhile option thanks to Pro hardware. There's a further twist here. Outputting PS5 Pro at 120Hz reveals even more changes, again in target frame rates, and some of them are curious. For a start, the performance mode caps at 80 frames per second with 120Hz set as the output, rather than the regular 60. This means that we get a rather unusual pattern of 2 unique frames followed by 1 duplicate over and over, which doesn't work especially well in creating a fluid sense of motion. Also odd is the treatment of the balanced mode. On PS5 Pro, this no longer caps at 40 FPS while outputting at 120Hz, and rather it targets a more arbitrary 70 to 72 FPS. Again, this only applies with the lock FPS toggle engaged, but it's clearly an unusual denomination to use within a 120Hz container. It also has clear drops under the mark, down to the 50s at points, and this frame rate reading is often wavering in the opening forest area. In short then, the better, more consistent option is to run the game at 60Hz using the FPS mode, and it's here that PS5 Pro gets the biggest benefit. There's one final thing to check, just out of personal curiosity really. The game's lock FPS toggle removes the frame rate cap altogether, and so I wondered if we could use Wuchang as a kind of frame rate benchmark tool. Sure enough, running the balanced mode on each console to fix their resolutions at 810p or 540p on Series S It's possible to get a raw demonstration of each machine's handling of Unreal Engine 5. By running at 120Hz, with that FPS lock disabled, we're unbound from any framerate cap, and the results play out as you might expect. Across a 6000 frame sample, PS5 and Series X run at a matching average of 50 FPS across the run. By comparison, PS5 Pro launches ahead with a 66 FPS average, which means we're getting a 32% gain in performance over the base model, while Series S trails the pack at an average of 37 FPS. It's also curious to note just how drastically PS5 Pro reduces the hitching in a matched route next to the other machines, making it the preferred pick for performance in general. Okay, that about wraps up this quick look at Wuchang. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video and many more, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.